When you study history and you study government, you teach them, you also have a great appreciation for them. And it seemed to me like that it's a kind of good thing we do as citizens to get involved and to try to help make good decisions that affect all the people. I personally believe that education is a key issue in every state, and especially in the state of Oregon. And so I wanted to be on education committees and deal with education issues and try to do the best I could to improve the teaching and the learning and the administration of our schools. And so those were things that meant a lot to me. Well, I think during the period of chairing the education committee, we did some things for early childhood education that were important. We came to believe that kindergarten and early childhood education was exceedingly important. So I worked with Nancy Riles on the House side. She was from Beaverton, I was from Corvallis, and at one stage, while Vicatia was governor, we got a bill passed that said all school districts were responsible for seeing that kindergarten education existed in the district. And that legislation moved those large districts into the business of having kindergartens. It was controversial. We had to do it with not necessarily the support of the legislative leadership. We had to talk to the governor, Tia, because he came from the Beaverton area, about whether he would go along with it. And Nancy Riles did a great job of that. We started the bill on the House side, and Nancy came to me and said, I don't think we're going to be able to do it this year. And I said, well, I have a bill on the Senate side. And we started it. We got it passed here and sent it over to the House. And by golly, they took it up and they got it passed there. And then Nancy took the bill and went to see Vicatia, and he agreed to support it. And so it made it. I like that. That's one of the things that I think we did in that committee that helped. Major 5 had profound effect, not just on public schools, but also on higher education and some other areas, because what it did was suddenly make a huge drain on the general fund that previously had been financed locally with the property tax. And property taxes were reduced dramatically and limits set on them, and they said, oh, well, don't worry, the general fund can pick up all that additional expense from the public schools. Well, it had only so much money. There was only so much money in the general fund, and often the projections as we began the session were that the general fund was in trouble and was going to have difficulty paying for what we needed to pay for to begin with. So that was a real problem. So finding enough money, basically, to stretch the budget. Happily, the income tax was doing well in those days, and often at the end of a session, we suddenly found the projections gave us more money than before. That, of course, fueled the desire for kicker, which the voters demanded and finally got. We attempted to, as I think Tony Van Fleet especially talked about, trying to have a more balanced tax system, having more than a three-legged stool rather than a two-legged stool, which is property tax and income tax. And that would have made sense if it would result in adequate revenues to do what we needed to do. I supported that. We had a couple times that we sent them out, and I supported them. The sales tax is a regressive tax, and you have to be careful because increasingly over time our tax system has tended to make it harder for working people, and so you have to be careful about the sales tax, but you can fashion them in such a way that they're much less regressive. And that's what we had done a couple times. The TIA sent a sales tax out once, and the legislature sent one out. I think the 93 session, one went out eventually. And they were voted down substantially. And that's we didn't get the balance that we wanted. Well, there was substantially more partisanship than when I began at the legislature. Although, maybe the kind of election that I was in when I was first elected had something to do with that. But the Republicans were in a distinct minority as a result of that election. They hadn't been before. And in fact, before that, there had been a series of coalition presidencies of the Senate that had been a combination of a few Democrats and the majority of the Republicans, and they had run the Senate for a while. And that, I think, didn't make sense, and that certainly didn't continue once we had this tremendous change. But Jason Bowe was elected our president. He was the first president I served with. He was president for 3 sessions. So that gave some stability. He and Vicatia were good friends. Vicatia was the Republican leader, and they got along well. In fact, the president appointed Vicatia to chair a committee, and there was a pretty good relationship. And we sort of looked at the Senate then as being a club. We divided up, sometimes rural, urban, sometimes east, west, who knows. We would have division over issues, but we were a kind of club. When we fought over the issues and that was done, we were all friends. We got along, and we didn't just oppose each other because it was a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. But over time that changed, and it changed not so much because of the leadership, but it changed, I think, as the country polarized and became more ideological, and I think now we see that. And also, one of the things that Jason Bowe did was he had a strong committee system. The committees, he carefully appointed the chairs of the committees. They had both parties represented on the committees, and the committees had a lot of latitude to do what they wanted to do. Now, I think what happened over time was that was lost as the caucuses began to exert more and more influence over what the policy was going to be, especially on key issues. And the caucuses tended to polarize. And it also made it possible for those groups that were interested in the result of those issues to have more influence on the issues, because caucus leaders often listened to some of the groups that were important. And the struggle over control of the Senate became very intense. And I think the relationship between members then disintegrated a bit. It became far more polarized and ideological than it had been before. And I regret that. Wayne Morse was one of the persons I really admired, and I helped him with his campaign. He had an attitude about, actually it was a way he measured issues, and he always tried to do what he said was to determine the public interest, and to, when you can, vote that way, or at least know the public interest. You can't always do that because you represent a district, a portion of the public, and you also have your own opinions about things too, and those are important, especially if you work hard on them and you make sure there are good, sensible opinions. But generally speaking, trying to figure out the public interest is a good way to channel your thinking on issues, and I tried to do that.